So we spent the morning talking a lot about one big country in Asia, China. Uh, for this next session, we're gonna talk about another big country, India, and we're really pleased, not quite to have with us in the flesh, but to have with us on the screen, um, Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow foreign policy at the Centre for East Asia Foreign Policy from the Brookings Institution. Um, Tanvi is a terrific expert. She is also host of the Global India podcast. Her work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing on India's relations with China and the United States. Um, that, um, Tanvi will be joining us for a fireside chat. There's no fire, but there will be chat. Um, and that chat will be moderated by the excellent Heidi Stroud-Watts from Bloomberg. So please join me in welcoming Tanvi and Heidi.
Tanvi, it's so great to have you with us. And as Anthony mentioned, unfortunately, no fire, not you by my side, but still, it's wonderful to have you with us at Asia Briefing Live today. And of course, from going to talking about China to talking about India, which has had such a banner year on the world stage diplomatically when it comes to events like hosting the rotating presidency for the G20. We've seen President Modi really front and center. Um, Can you start by setting the scene when it comes to the geopolitical significance of what India is trying to achieve and, what its global ambitions are in the next 5 to 10 years?
Firstly, thank you, Heidi, and thanks to the Asia Society Australia as well. It's a real pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I think for India, it is seeing the world, or it assesses the world in terms of what the impact will be on Indian interests, whether that's kind of geopolitical dynamics, economic, technological dynamics and trends, or for that matter, even ideological. And for India, if you'd asked Indian policymakers, in some ways, they would want to have their own version of hide and bide, which is kind of to focus on, economic development and growth, which would fuel kind of India's economic and technological transformation, its aspirations to take its rightful place on the world stage as Indian policymakers see it, and its ability to kind of shape the environment around it for its own security. However, for a variety of reasons, including the geopolitical dynamics you mentioned, India finds itself, thanks to geography, thanks to its own relationships, thanks to the fact that it lives in a neighborhood where it has two nuclear-armed rivals, one of which is China, that it has found itself having to, on the one hand, grapple with some of the geopolitical challenges it faces, the geopolitical competition that is unfolding. But you're also seeing in India that to achieve its objectives, security, economic prosperity, technological transformation, and its rightful place on the world stage, is also using that geopolitical competition and interest in a number of countries and having India as a partner to achieve those objectives. So this is an India that wants to be an independent pole, wants to make its own choices as much as possible, recognizes that it cannot do that alone, however. It recognizes that self-sufficiency or isolation is not an option. And so it is looking for partnerships to both deal with the challenges it is facing, to want to offer some solutions where it can to kind of global and regional problems, but also at the same time, to find opportunities in the competitive space that we see geopolitically, geoeconomically, and technologically as well.
And I think the most fascinating thing is that India does not sort of exist alone in the geopolitical narrative that we talk about, right? It sits as a counterweight economically, strategically to China. Do you think that India is comfortable with that narrative, and how does that inform policies when it comes to dealing with international partners?
It's interesting. For in some ways, the world or several countries have now see China as a challenge, and there's no doubt that India-China tensions have intensified over the last few years. But what's interesting is that India doesn't see India-China relations or India-China rivalry necessarily from the lens of US-China competition, as others might. Much kind of like Australia has its own dynamics with China, its own concerns, its own set of relationships dynamics with China. So does India. And so India's seen China as a challenge since at least the late 1950s, if not before, both China alone and China in conjunction with Pakistan. So it's been thinking about this for a long period of time. And so in some ways, it doesn't feel that, sometimes you'll have Beijing and Chinese outlets say that, and Chinese officials will say this too, India, don't fall into a US trap on kind of India-China relations. I think I found some Indian officials actually find that a bit insulting, because they don't see their dynamics with China through a US lens. To the extent that there are problems, and there are a few in the India-China relationship, India sees that being about the bilateral relationship and bilateral dynamics. And so India is quite comfortable, I think, in some senses, because this kind of concern about China is not being imposed on them. They have their own concerns. And second, as I mentioned, I don't think it's lost on them that this offers opportunities for them as well, as countries look and companies look for alternatives, and as India itself looks for alternatives economically, technologically, but also it makes India a more attractive partner to others. At the same time, it offers India more partnership options. So I don't think it hesitates. Having said that, I think India, one thing that I will say is, for India as a country that has a border with China, it sees the China kind of concerns and challenge sometimes differently than countries that don't share a long border, one that is disputed with China. So it does see China through a continental prism, which not every other partner of it sees in the same way.
So would you say a country like Australia should be investing into this theme, this idea of India as a counterweight to China, the way that we've just spoken about, or does that thought process need to be reshaped in a way?
So I think there's little doubt that there's been strategic convergence between Delhi and Canberra on China, and particularly shared concerns about China's assertiveness and its uncertain intentions. That has been a subject of strategic convergence. That convergence has been a driver of deeper cooperation across the board between India and Australia. And it's also incentivized both countries to manage differences. So I don't think that is in doubt. I think both countries see each other as useful from that framing. Having said that, I think a relationship that is built on only one pillar alone is less sustainable and stable than a relationship, including that which India and Australia share, which has multiple pillars. It'll just be more stable. It'll be more sustainable. It will mean that, when they are kind of headwinds, you're not going to, or, when you're not going to have a kind of a shaky foundation or kind of a pillar that if it starts to crack, the whole relationship and the edifice falls. So I think, take work together in terms of a shared vision of the Indo-Pacific and ensuring a rules-based order prevails, but don't just build a relationship that is about this one pillar. So I like the fact that the Australia-India relationship has multiple pillars, whether that's defense and security, whether that's economic, whether that's a technology partnership, energy partnership, not to mention the people-to-people dimension as well.
Just for our audience in person here today, I should have mentioned this at the beginning actually, but if you have any burning questions, send them through. It's the QR code on your table, and we'll try and get through some of those as well. But, coming back to the bilateral relationship, if all indications are that Modi and India want to have a truly global, significant diplomatic footprint. Does that mean there's a ceiling when it comes to Australia-India relations? How does Canberra rate as in terms of being a priority partner, do you think?
I don't think there is a ceiling as such. I know recently Rajesh Rajagopalan, who's a great professor at one of the universities in India, mentioned the word ceiling. I think he meant it in a slightly different way. I will say I can't recall a relationship for India that has moved at such speed in such a short period of time. And just to kind of highlight, because I will make the point, the kind of bluff, the bottom line is that, yes, it is a priority partner for New Delhi, but I just want to kind of tell you how I don't think it's not just about kind of the speed. There's certain things that, for instance, India is doing with with Australia that, frankly, it's not even doing with the US, which in some ways is a far closer partner. So, if you look at defense ties today, it's gone from very little to India and Australia doing reciprocal deployments of their P-8s, the maritime surveillance aircraft. Prime Minister Albanese was the first world leader to be welcomed onto India's indigenous aircraft carrier. Deputy Prime Minister Miles was the first. It was one of the first people to get a ride on India's P-8, I believe it was. I don't think you haven't seen American kind of leaders or ministers secretaries get to do that. Economically, Australia and India have signed an economic partnership agreement. I hope it goes further. But you've also seen, Australia's become the partner of choice for India on a range of trilaterals with France, with Indonesia, with Japan, which has essentially also got kind of folded into the Quad with Australia, India, Japan, and the US. These are all quite, these kind of experiments for India that doesn't do alliances and for whom coalitions are fairly new. And the fact that Australia is a chosen preferred partner by India tells you how much it features now as well. But also the fact that you've seen on, as I said, in education and energy, that it is a country that India looks to, critical minerals, another area. It has become a priority partnership because India judges partnerships according to who are going to be useful in achieving Indian objectives. And I think Australia meets that and is being seen as a country that is responsive to Indian kind of India's objectives as well. I will say you also see the priority that the partnership gets in terms of the level and frequency of visits, as well as you've seen who is handling the portfolio in New Delhi. That's within the bureaucracies. That's often a good sign. In Australia, ranks high, and I like the fact that you've seen now kind of commerce, China, and clean energy join the other three traditional Cs, curry, Commonwealth, and cricket, which I hope also remain in the relationship. And I will just say kind of, one thing where two things that have helped the relationship, or one thing that has helped, and one quote which tells you how much Australia has risen in India's estimation as a priority partner, is the thing that has helped is that India has now seen this interest in India in Canberra sustain over multiple governments, which always helps in New Delhi. But the quote that I'll give you is something the Indian foreign minister said in the time that we're all supposed to forget happened, but when there were tensions over AUKUS between Australia and France, he was in France and he was asked by in a think tank discussion, he was asked, what do you think about AUKUS? And he said, I've just laid out why France is an important partner, and it is a very special partner for India, goes back a long way. But he then said in his next sentence, I like to see my partners get along as India. I like to see my partners get along, and France is an important partner. But then he said, and the US and Australia are equally important partners. To me, that was pretty significant.
I mean, you've rightly mentioned the elevation of the Quad. I am curious though, because India is still a founding member of BRICS. Does BRICS still matter fundamentally, or conversely, is BRICS perhaps more appropriately suited or more significant for India given the development diplomacy that it practices? Does that speak more to the kind of, truer economic realities of India and its development to this point?
as you mentioned, you see in India that is a member of various groupings, and it often comes up. I will say, one thing that there's certain kind of axioms of Indian foreign policy. One is that India's partnerships, while it maintains a diversified portfolio of partners, those partnerships are not equidistant. Another axiom is while India might be a member of various groupings, those are qualitatively not the same. And so, take the Quad. I think if you look at and you just compare the Quad and the BRICS joint statements, but also the kind of reason India is in them, the Quad is for something. BRICS is not something. And what is it not? BRICS was useful for India as a non-Western platform. It rose at a time that India felt that its voice wasn't being heard on the global stage. And it emerged at a time that India and China were working together in a number of domains, particularly in the multilateral space, on issues like trade, cyber governance, climate change, even non-proliferation. BRICS will remain kind of one of the groupings India is part of, including an expanded BRICS. But I do think what you've seen is that its utility and relevance for India has diminished. It will remain a member of BRICS because it is one of the arenas in which India can engage with the countries in the developing world. It also does not want to leave that space and cede that space to China. And I think you see in India that also finds places that it can work with Russia, with whom it still has a traditional partnership, even though, again, not as relevant as it used to be. But I think you've seen for India, both because Russia and China seem to be trying to make BRICS and other organizations, not just non-West organizations, but anti-West organizations. That is not useful for an India for whom the West and its Western partners are crucial, if not indispensable, for India's objectives. And second, I think India-China tensions have spilt over into BRICS. And I think BRICS expansion, because it dilutes kind of India's role in some ways, will be a reason I think you will see that India will stay part of BRICS. It will engage. It will partly try to make sure that its interests are protected. For instance, you didn't see in the joint statement a unified statement supporting Russia, for instance, on the kind of Russian, after the Russian invasion. You also didn't see any endorsement of China's Belt and Road Initiative or Global Development Initiative, which Beijing wanted. And that is in part because India runs interference on these things. And so I think India will stay in BRICS, but it will go down. It has already gone down India's priority list. I would watch out for IBSA, the India, Brazil, South Africa trilateral, because I think even within BRICS, these three countries whose roles have been diluted will strive to work together on some issues.
We've talked a little about the tensions between Beijing and New Delhi, and I do wonder if there's prospects for an improvement in that relationship, given that China is still India's biggest neighbor and second largest trading partner. Do you see incentive there for more collaboration rather than competition?
I think you've seen definitely a desire to stabilize the border situation, because there was a fatal border clash, as your audience might know, in 2020. And that served, along with, there was a 1-2 punch of that, as well as China's handling of COVID, that really has driven the India-China relationship to its lowest point since they fought a war in 1962. There have been occasionally talk about a kind of a, what if India and China, strike a grand bargain if Beijing offers India a deal it can't refuse, and that would take India out of the balancing game. I think and you saw an attempt in the spring and summer to try to stabilize the boundary dispute, get some movement. But we so far haven't seen that. In fact, what you saw is more tension over the map that China released, Xi Jinping not turning up to the G20 summit. And just today, you've heard India kind of reports of, we haven't seen confirmation of India arresting executives of a Chinese company, including a Chinese national. So, we hear kind of this, yes, in theory, there would be interest in stabilizing the relationship. It's quite similar to what the US is trying to do, which is not necessarily expect some grand improvement, but really wanting to set a floor to the relationship and ensure risk reduction measures work. But I think gone are the heydays of India wanting to see China as this economic opportunity. Today, India sees economic ties with China as a vulnerability more than an opportunity. And as an asymmetric relationship, there's concern that this offers China leverage on India. But I think more fundamentally, why are we not going to see, in my view, a deal? And we can, analysts can be wrong. My general sense is because the border clash has changed it was an inflection point in 2020. There's a general sense in India that China violated boundary agreements that the two countries worked on for over a 25-year period. And even if you reach a border stabilization on 1 or 2 points, what's the guarantee that China won't do that again? That is the sense. And that means you now see a fundamentally different border between India and China that actually looks a lot more like the India-Pakistan border, much more tense, and an attitude in India of verify, don't trust. You've also seen the longer this clash lasts, you've seen India make domestic and foreign policy changes to kind of both build its own capabilities, but also a balancing coalition of its own that I think will have a lock-in effect. So I am not expecting, I think there will be attempts to stabilize, but I don't expect a kind of a grand bargain. I would actually also be worried about a crisis escalation again, which is something I think in India people are aware of. And as the Russian invasion and indeed the terrorist attack by Hamas against Israel show, you never know when what you think is a stable situation becomes unstable.
One of the potential threats to India's ascent on the diplomatic front globally, of course, and this is one of the audience questions that has come through, so I know a lot of people are interested, the fallout that we've seen between India and Canada of the alleged assassination of the Sikh separatist. What are your views as to how India navigates this, and what does this tell us about the conduct, the operations of policies like this, both beyond and within borders?
I think, there's a lot we don't know on the specifics of this. So, I'm hesitant to comment. I am one of those people who prefer not to add more heat and like to focus on light. So I want to wait for more information from both sides, frankly, before I draw conclusions on that. But I do think we can, there are a few things that this dynamic shows us, including the fact that there are, as close as India's partnerships with the West have become, there are headwinds that we have to be conscious of. In the US, those of us who have been working on US-India relations for a while, remember that it's exactly a decade ago where there was a very serious diplomatic spat between India and the US, which ground things to a halt. So I think needing to be aware that there are these kind of obstacles that can arise. But I think it also shows that as much as we have a lot to learn about each other in terms of the West and Western countries and India. And I say this as one of the learnings that has become evident to me over these last few weeks is that we in the West might have a concept of the West, but India doesn't necessarily share that concept. So for instance, it doesn't put Canada in the same category of partnerships it does the US and Australia and France. It is not as close to Canada. While for us it's obviously a very close ally. I think you've also seen some India not understanding what that close alliance relationship means. And that, there are certain things that and certain expectations that exist within alliances that might not in a partnership. So I think there is that learning. And it's we've learned to kind of deal with this aspect that India is not an ally but a close partner. But now you see these differences throughout. I think there's also one of the things we have to figure out is there's also an expectation among different sets of expectations that sometimes clash. I think we expect India to behave like a Western ally, but don't necessarily treat it in some ways as even a Western partner in this sense. And so, or the level of solidarity. And I'll point out, I think it really depends on Western countries. So it wouldn't be lost on India that in the last two crises, one with China, one with Pakistan, that it's had, the US, Australia, Japan, and France did show what India believed was solidarity with India. It did not see that from many European countries, and it did not see that from Canada in a way that I think there would have been an expectation that if it had been any other Western countries dealing with China unilaterally changing status quo with the use of force, or attempts to, that you would have seen those countries in Europe and Canada, speak up. But I think there's also an expectation in India that of being chosen and being prioritized over, in the Americans' case, American allies. And I think it needs to realize that allies are special and will get priority in some instances. So to me, it's going to be it's a sensitive situation. It's a delicate situation. It needs to be handled with care. It has the potential to have spillover effects. But I think it also shows us some of the gaps, particularly in kind of perceptions that do exist, and some can be closed. Some I think we just have to navigate.
There's also the situation when it comes to the rise of Hindu nationalism. Is there a way that Western partners of India should be dealing with that?
I think that step I can take this in the question of how do you navigate domestic politics and polarization more broadly in India. And I think there are a few different things. I don't think there's any silver bullet, but I think there's a few things that I do think could help navigate. One is that I think at the start, we have to recognize that we don't get a vote. We have to deal with the India that Indian voters choose. We might not like what that looks like, but that is the reality of the situation. I think second, need to do amongst Western countries a lot more. If India is becoming such an important partner, or at least an increasingly important partner, I think we have to invest more in understanding dynamics within India. And I've seen whether it's in the US more closely, but from what I hear, even in Australia, a lot of investment in things like STEM education and things. But I think there needs to be a fundamental contemporary history and politics of India. Sometimes these are derided as useless social sciences, but these are the things and the factors that will make or break the relationship. And so I think there needs to be an investment in that. I think third, and this will build upon that second thing, is a better assessment of scenarios that might play out in India and how they affect American or Australian interests. And then finally, and I think this is actually the most important, even if I listed, kind of at the end, is by having a clear understanding of kind of what our interests and priorities are, what trade-offs we're willing to make amongst those prior imperatives we have with India or not, and then a clear understanding of what our concerns are, or indeed even what our red lines are, especially in terms of Indian domestic politics spilling over into our countries, and conveying those concerns to India, usually privately, helps better. Partly by explaining that if those concerns and sensitivities aren't taken care of, it will affect the sustainability of this relationship that is important to India as well. So it's not just like India is important to other countries. For India, these partnerships are important as well. And so I think conveying that in India, that itself says it's very sensitive to interference in its domestic politics from abroad, that other countries expect the same.
Tanvi, we started the conversation talking about what a milestone year it's been for India and for PM Modi. And I wanted to end by asking you about how you see it kind of transpiring on the ground, right? We know that this is a year that India overtook China in terms of the world's biggest population. We know that economic growth is going gangbusters. We know that the stock market has been, the darling of emerging market investors. Is that optimism kind of translating on the ground? How do ordinary Indians, to your knowledge, feel about the outlook for their country?
I think if you ask 10 Indians, you'll probably get 10 opinions. It is an incredibly diverse country, incredibly hard to poll. I'll kind of say that, you find particularly young Indians that are polled are aspirational. They are in many places optimistic, despite, high unemployment and not enough jobs. You find a country that, and especially young people, which now constitute, a significant, if not majority of the population, who are much more connected with the world than their kind of predecessors were, both kind of physically in terms of the internet, or virtually in the internet, but also in terms of being interested and aware of the world and how it shapes India. They do want to see, and I think this is why it gets mentioned so much within Indian politics, India, be respected on the world stage, a recognition that the world offers both challenges and opportunities. But I think a couple of things I would say is, Richard Nixon in 1967 wrote a foreign affairs article where he said 4 countries will determine the next century will be the Asian century, and 4 countries will determine kind of the shape of it: the U.S., Japan, China, and he said India. And the paragraph about India, he said, this country has so much potential, it'll all depend on performance. And so whether it's India has this window of opportunity, can it take advantage? Can its leaders make the choices? I would like to see an India that's being far more open in terms of and more liberalized in terms of trade and investment policy, even though, yes, that means tough political decisions, which might not be made in an election year. But, find ways to not let this moment pass, taking advantage far more quickly in a far more significant way of these tailwinds that India has, which will also help it navigate the headwinds. Because as aspirational as particularly young Indians are, that also means they have very high expectations. And if those are not met, you will see that kind of, the headwinds side overtake, I think, the tailwinds.
Tanvi, we'll have to leave it there, but it's been a fascinating and really valuable conversation. We appreciate your time. Tanvi Madan is a Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Centre for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings University. Really great to have you with us. I'm going to hand you back to Anthony now.
Thank you, Heidi.